Who else is ready?
Chairperson, the Cannabis Action Group is ready.
Okay. The first ones, are they still not here?
No, they're not.
So at some point we will have to take that they're not coming. So can we
Yeah.
allow the Cannabis Action Group?
Hi, good morning, Chair, and good morning to the legislators. Thank you very much for allowing me to make this presentation today. First off, I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Monitoring Group for the good work that they've been doing over the past 20 years with regard to recording what's happening in Parliament, especially with regard to cannabis, because it is with their hard work that I'm as informed as I am today. Jumping right in, the first slide, I'd just like to cover some misconceptions by this portfolio committee and others that this whole cannabis thing is relatively new. Please, can we go back to the first slide? Right, because how it's happened in South Africa and how it should happen is that cannabis research, starting from the bottom, should inform the cannabis white paper. And the cannabis white paper should inform the cannabis master plan, and the master plan should inform the cannabis bill or act. Now I'm going to go through each one of those steps individually. If we can go to the next slide, please. Cannabis, the next slide, please. Cannabis research in South Africa has actually been going on since 1999. And over R1 billion has been spent on researching cannabis, and these cannabis licenses were issued by the Department of Health, and the Department of Health requires research licenses to submit annual reports. These annual reports have basically never been forthcoming, and they've been very scant in the details when the details have been made public. The Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, now Land Reform and Development. So I'm going to deal with those two as one. And the Department of Health, SAPS, DTI, various SOEs, the Agricultural Research Council, and various other departments and government vehicles were involved without financial management oversight or reporting. Now, the best we got out of all of this research that happened over the past 20 years and the R1 billion spent on it was the National Agricultural Marketing Council presented the hemp feasibility study to Parliament in January 2017. All the projections were based on Colorado hemp trials and not on South African research data. So the best we can is assume that hemp will perform as well as it did in Colorado. We don't have anything from the research to actually show that it does. None of the parliamentarians asked for financial oversight. None of the parliamentarians asked the hard questions. Is hemp agronomically viable in South Africa? What is the yield per hectare for the various cultivars? These answers should be informing the cannabis white paper. And of course, none of this research that has been performed at great cost was made available for peer or scientific review. And like I was saying, this data is what should be informing the white paper. Now, if we move on to the white paper, this was requested by the National Assembly with the creation of the Central Drug Authority in 1999. It was released in 2004, incomplete, rejected by Parliament for not being scientific in 2009. The Cannabis Working Group presented their white paper to the Central Drug Authority and to Parliament in 2013. And in 2014, in fact, it was handed to the President himself at SONA, as well as the Health Minister by Mariam Brasini. All that was after that, the Central Drug Authority had a cannabis roundtable, which was to inform the cannabis master plan that was expected to be released in 2016. Since then, nothing has been forthcoming with regard to the cannabis master plan, except this, which Dallard has suddenly popped up with. All we've got from the Medical Research Council and the Central Drug Authority with regard to the cannabis master plan was cannabinoid use and alcohol use, respectively, from the MRC and CDA in response to the private members bill launched by Mario Ambrosini, the Medical Innovation Bill. Moving on to the next slide. The master plan, which is meant to be informed by the cannabis white paper, which is still not forthcoming, was requested by the Department of DSD and CDA in 2014. Dallard appeared with it in 2021, and a lot of the master plan, which is now aiming at commercial use and wadi-wah and has a whole structure of how things are going to be done, is in direct opposition with the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill. These two things are sitting in complete contrast to each other. Moving on to the next slide, the bill definitions. In the Drug and Drugs Trafficking Act and the Medicines and Related Substances Act, up until the Constitutional Court judgment, the definition was relatively simple. Aside from the ambiguous use of a colloquial term, dacha, cannabis, dacha, the whole plant or any portion thereof, except, and this exception is very strange because I'm going to deal with that now or later. Dronabinol minus trans delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Now, since the Constitutional Court judgment and what that definition was set in those two acts, we've now expanded this definition outside of the Constitutional Court's direction to include a product thereof. The inclusion of all the hemp exclusions, which is 2-3 paragraphs, inclusions of other cannabinoids and cannabinols, and the inclusion of synthetic substances with cannabis-like effects. Now, that is the most unscientific term I've ever seen legislated, ever. These legislators involved with this should hang their heads in shame. Moving on to the Drug and Drugs Trafficking Act in 1992, there was an inclusion of product thereof and the inclusion of tetrahydrocannabinol. Now, these changes that happened to the Medicines and Related Substances Act and the Drug and Drug Trafficking Act certainly happened without Section 195 public consultation or public participation. That much is clear in how these definitions have evolved. Moving on to the next slide. We are left currently with an unscientific definition of insanity. In 2015, the Department of Social Development at their Cannabis Roundtable got stuck on it. Is it a tree? Is it a leaf? Is it a plant? And I swear we are not much further now, because from a simple, understandable definition, which I'm telling you is easily found on Google, if you go to Google and you type in definition cannabis, it will probably read something like, cannabis is an annual herbaceous plant with segregated leaves. Now, that's relatively simple English to understand, except what we've evolved to in South Africa is from a simple definition with an ambiguous term dacha attached to it and an exclusion. Now that exclusion has become the law, and the exclusion is entirely ridiculous. On the 22nd of May, 2020, the amendments to the Medicines and Related Substances Act were made and gazetted 43347. I challenge anybody involved in that legislative change to explain the Schedule 6 change successfully to anybody. And that could be a pharmacist, a chemist, a doctor. Schedule 6 in that amendment shows exactly how much the people involved have no clue what they are talking about. They've made changes with regard to the definitions, and it is complete and utter nonsense. Now I'm going to branch off a little there because I have to. Deal with the preamble in the Medicines and Related Substances Act. The Department of Health and the Department of SAHPRA, South African Health, Allied and Products Regulatory Authority, are constantly bringing up the INCB and the Single Drug Convention Treaty. But in the preamble of the Medicine and Related Substances Act, it's very clear what the Department of Health and SAHPRA are allowed to regulate. And it is compounds, compound medicines. For example, the vaccines that have been made available and authorized for use by SAHPRA are a compound. That compound is made of various molecules. SAHPRA is not applying the exact same scientific rigor of separating the vaccines into a molecule by molecule and legislating, scheduling, and allowing for that, like they're doing with cannabis. Further to the preamble of the Act, it is to be noted that the Department of Health and SAHPRA are to revise scheduling every 5 years for any medicines that is registered. Now, this brings me to the scheduling. And the scheduling is relatively important because previously in the Act, it was merely cannabis in the Act. Now suddenly it's tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol, and these two substances, quite frankly, were added without scientific rigor from the Department of Health or SAHPRA. Their positioning in the scheduling makes no sense. There is no evidence for it to be there in the first place, and the only reason that tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol are shifted up and down the scheduling willy-nilly from 7 to 6 to 4 to 6 to 7 is because of court instruction or threat of court instruction. There is no scientific rigor involved in shifting the scheduling of the cannabinoids in cannabis. Moving on to the next slide. The direction and solution, if we could move on to the next slide, please. The direction and solution that the Cannabis Action Group suggest for South Africa. Article 36 of this International Narcotics Control Board Single Convention Treaty is very clear that parties and signatories to this convention can set their own rules and regulations. This path has already been set by the Constitutional Court by allowing cannabis for private use. The Department of Health don't need to think about it. The Department, SAHPRA, don't need to think about it. The Constitutional Court has set us on this path already. Section 36 of the South African Constitution was very nicely covered by Schindler's yesterday, and it basically allows for a less invasive, more reasonable restriction that can be set as per the South African Constitution. I would like to bring up Section 22. The right to choose your own occupation and trade, provided regulations are set. Now, reading those three together, it's clear the Constitutional Court has set us on this path where the Republic of South Africa can set its own rules and regulations. Moving on to the next slide. In conclusion, the Cannabis Action Group oppose vehemently the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill, which seeks to recriminalize existing crimes simply through the change of dacha to cannabis. The master plan and the unconstitutional changes that have already been made in the various acts, the Drug and Drugs Trafficking Act, the Medicines and Related Substances Act, the Road Traffic Management Act, will be opposed here, now, at the National Council of Provinces and in court if need be, for the reasons mentioned in my presentation. Research, reports, the Cannabis White Paper, the Cannabis Master Bill, licensing and definitions are all corrupt. They are unintelligible and would fail Standard 6 English. The Cannabis Action Group suggests that South Africa and the legislators continue with the path set by the Constitutional Court to allow the signatory party, the Republic of South Africa, to set its own regulations, and as other jurisdictions have done with regard to Article 36 of the INCB. We suggest the removal of cannabis and all definitions from the Medicines and Related Substances Act and the Drug and Drugs Trafficking Act. We ask, request, and I am very thankful that for once my public presentations over the past 20 years to Parliament are actually being recorded for posterity and being made available on YouTube. We ask that this continues and that public participation to create a new bill with proper and correct definitions upon which a sensible policy can be built. Any further delay will only expand on the biggest black market that Parliament has created in the world. Well done. Parliament created the largest black market in cannabis by allowing it for 2 years to go unregulated, except for the so-called licensed operations by SAPRA. SAPRA and the Department of Health and the Department of Justice, I am letting you know those are not licensed strawberries available on the black market. I thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Andre du Plessis, for your presentation. Members, any questions or comments to the presentation made by Mr. du Plessis? Dr. Neville Dragons.
Thank you very much. I have no questions directly to the presenter. I do thank the presenter for the presentation, but I now have a lot of questions for the department. So I won't share my questions now, but I do think we have to question the departments, especially the Department of Justice again. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neville Dragons. Obviously, that opportunity is going to come immediately after we are done with the public hearings. Any further questions? No, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Mr. du Plessis, for your research and your presentation. I think it's highly welcome.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much.